Welcome to Off the Page. I'm Will Cain. I'm on the phone with Arnold Kling, a Cato Institute scholar. And Arnold, as Republicans and Democrats are wrangling over what it means to be too big to fail, or who is too big to fail, or how to stop the policy of too big to fail, you've put forward a pretty clear argument that I like, that I think I'm summing up as this. Too big to fail is too big to exist. Break up the banks, let's cap their size. Is that it?
Yeah, I think it's not, break banks back to the level they were in the 1920s, but basically take the top 10 banks, let's say, and break them into about 40 banks, something on that order.
Right. What about and I know here I'm talking to a Cato Institute scholar, but what about the somewhat, I guess, libertarian argument that is essentially Alan Greenspan's position that the market is always right? If the market is saying we need big banks, then we'll have big banks, and the benefits are going to outweigh the costs of that.
Well, I would make that argument if we were starting from a free market position in banks in which, there were, the financial system wasn't being shaped by the government, but in fact it is shaped by the government. And it's really hard to know what the natural size of banks would be because we are so far from having an unregulated financial sector.
So you're saying, look, what we have now are not products of the free market, so that's extremely hypothetical. And what we have now, in fact, are government-created banks of this size. Is that right? Or at least government-enabled?
That would be my best guess. I mean, we don't. My best guess is that the way that the fact that creditors believe that these institutions are too big to fail, it becomes a major competitive advantage for large firms. And so we've given a competitive advantage to large firms. And so we certainly can't be sure that the mix of large and small firms in the banking industry is what it would be in a natural market.
Isn't it also, Arnold, I guess a fair statement to say, at this point, we can say that the large banks, at least, were not free market players, that at least by implication, they were quasi-governmental.
Yeah, that's my sense, is that when the way to think of it is to think of every large financial institution as if it were like Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae, where it has private shareholders but is deemed as having a public responsibility. So public responsibilities included, responsibilities for Community and Reinvestment Act and all sorts of other things, both informal and formal responsibilities, so that Congress could lean on banks to do things, and conversely, there's an expectation that in the end these banks would be bailed out if they get into trouble.
Did Congress lean on the big banks any more than the small banks to fulfill those policy goals?
I think it was actually in legislation that larger banks had more obligations. Plus, you had the fact that for example, in merger decisions whether to approve mergers or not, the regulators explicitly, made the bank's performance on things like Community Reinvestment Act a criterion for approving mergers. So that was another way in which they had leverage on big banks.
Right. And you say the trade-off for this was that the banks had the implied notion that they'd be bailed out if the policies harmed them?
Yeah. Or not so much if policies harmed them, but if anything went wrong. Yeah.
Right. What about just from a sheer, efficacy argument? Aren't there benefits to big banks? Aren't there economies of scale in allowing these big banks to exist? Don't they get more efficient?
My understanding of the studies is that there are economies of scale, but those economies of scale disappear at much lower scale than our very large banks. I think it's pretty hard actually to investigate, the marginal effect of, growing from, 8 billion to 25 billion or whatever. I mean, you don't have that many examples to look at. But I think the general picture is that the efficiencies don't really build with size to that degree.
And that's the argument of the bankers, right? That these financial supermarkets are good for us.
Yeah, I think that's an extremely difficult argument to make because
Right.
I don't think the economies of scope, which is what we're talking about, combining lots of different different banking functions, are always more impressive in the eyes of the big CEOs than they are in the eyes of any customer.
Last, do you think limiting the size of banks would absolve us of the systemic risk of bank failure then?
Absolutely not. We know from past history that we've had failures of smaller institutions. We had the S&L crisis. We had the bank failures of the 30s. So you absolutely cannot solve the problem simply by breaking up banks. It's not a sufficient condition, but I think it may be necessary in order to get away from the too big to fail problem and get away from it, to break some of the most important moral hazard involved in the relationship.
So what you're saying is
banks.
we'll still have the risk cycles, we'll still have bank failures, but they won't be socialized. They won't become everybody's problem.
I think they're less likely to be socialized. It depends, of course, on the extent to which they're correlated with one another. I think if sort of every bank fails at once, I'm sure a government will want to step in and try to do something. But I think it will reduce one element of the moral hazard, which is the ability that the very largest banks have now to basically lean on the government for regulation that tilts the playing field in their favor, and to lean on the government in to the extent that they ever get in trouble to say that, well, we're too big to fail.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Arnold.